this particular presentation. Great. So the focus of today's presentation, hopefully people can see my screen. Give me a quick nod, those of you who have your cameras on, if you can see that. Yes, good. The focus of today's presentation is high school English, which we often get many inquiries about from worried parents or worried students who are maybe finishing year 6, entering year 7 for the first time, and feeling quite overwhelmed about what exactly goes on in high school. And I completely empathize with all you students and all the parents as well, because my experience in year 7 English and beyond was very confronting and very overwhelming. At first, I felt extremely lost as to what to do, and it took me quite a long time before I actually understood what was going on. So the point of today's presentation, hopefully, is not only to settle your nerves a little bit, but also provide you with enough insight to know what to expect. So you're not really blindsided when you get into high school and feel like, no one has given you a guide about what to expect. Now, a bit of a warning before I begin, the high school English curriculum and syllabus is constantly changing. It is something that is shifting always. So for example, when I was in high school, my syllabus is very different to the one that is being taught now. And because of that, some of the content that I might cover today may not be, 100% relevant to you when you get into year 12. For some of you, that will be in 7 years' time, so a long time away. However, the overall structure of what to expect will be there. Now, just a little bit about myself before I dive into the substantive part of the lesson. Good evening, everyone. My name is Chewy Wang. I'm one of the founders here at Cogito Tutoring, and I have been teaching English now with Cogito for well over 6 years, which is a very long time. I completed my high school at Shaw School in 2017, where I received an ATAR of 99.95. I also came first in English Advanced in the state in that year. I've also completed my Bachelor of Laws recently at the University of Sydney, and I'm currently working as a judge's associate in a Commonwealth court. I won't say which one in order to protect my identity a little bit there. Okay, let's dive into the presentation. So let's talk very briefly about what the structure of high school English is. And what I mean by structure is what is the order of learning, which we will get into more detail later on. But in terms of what to expect at a very broad, high level, English, unfortunately, or fortunately, if you really love English, is the only compulsory subject in New South Wales high schools. Now, this may surprise you, some of you who have not done too much research on this, but in New South Wales high schools, you can even drop maths in year 11 and 12. That's right. You can stop studying maths. You can stop studying all sciences if you really wanted to. But the one subject that you can't drop, that you can never not study anymore, is English. So from year 7 onwards, you must study English, and you must take at least one English subject in your HSC exams. Now, some people choose to take more than one English subject, which I'll address in just a second, but you have to take at least one English subject. Now, from years 7 to 10 in a high school, English is a generalized subject. Now, what a generalized subject means is not everyone in the state studies the same thing. So your school basically determines what you study. And that makes things a little bit difficult. I hope you can imagine why. Because every school is kind of studying slightly different things, and every school will move at different paces. But when you get into year 11 and year 12, English becomes a standardized subject. That means everyone in the entire state in New South Wales and high school all studies following exactly the same curriculum, and many of you will even start studying exactly the same texts. Now, if you don't know what I mean by texts, don't worry, because I have a whole 20-minute section dedicated to what texts are and why texts are important in high school English. Now, in year 11 and 12, English is divided into 4 subjects, which get increasingly more difficult and more advanced. Now, you have to take in year 12 either English Standard or English Advanced. Now, most of you, especially I assume the higher achieving students, you will probably take English Advanced, Everyone else will generally take English Standard, but you have to pick either one or two, English Standard or English Advanced. The only real difference between English Standard and English Advanced is the difficulty of the texts that you will be studying. Otherwise, they're mostly the same thing. So they'll mostly be asking you to write the same kinds of essays and produce the same kinds of texts and pieces of writing. They'll both involve, for example, and I'll once again address this later, writing some kind of imaginative piece. The only real difference is the difficulty. So what texts will you be studying? What about the questions that they ask you? How hard are those questions? That is the key difference between standard and advanced. Now, if you really love English, which I did in high school, you can also choose to do additional English subjects. And there are two on offer in New South Wales at the moment. Those are English Extension 1 and English Extension 2. Now, English Extension 1 is basically just more English that's more difficult. So you'll be studying texts that are much, much more difficult than you will study in either English Standard or Advanced. They can often be incredibly long or incredibly complex, or you'll be studying a wide range of texts from a specific time period. For example, when I was in high school and I did English Extension 1, we did a Cold War subject. Has anyone here heard of the Cold War before? I'm sure some of you have. Okay, particular period of history in the 20th century. And we did an entire array of texts on the Cold War. English Extension 1 will also ask you to write very long essays. Now, in English Standard or English Advanced, the essay length can vary between 800 to 1,200 words, whereas in English Extension 1, you're expected to write somewhere in the ballpark of, say, 2,000 words. So they're much, much longer essays and sometimes even imaginative or creative pieces as well. Now, English Extension 2, I'm not really going to talk about because Extension 2 is very strange. Extension 2 is not more English. It's an English project, if you will. That means that you can basically choose what you want to do, which is a very strange subject. It means, for example, if you really love writing short stories, you could write a 10,000-word short story and submit that as your only piece of work for the whole year for English Extension 2. If you really love writing essays, you could write a 10,000-word essay or a 10,000-word script. As you can imagine, and as you've probably picked up, the only real requirement for English Extension 2 is the word count. So you have to produce something between, and it's usually 7,500 to 10,000 words, and you have to submit that. It could be an essay, it could be a script, it could be a really long collection of poems, it could be a short story, it could be anything. So we're not really going to address English Extension 2 because that's, for students who want to create their own project and submit that. We're just going to focus on basically what to expect if you're going to be studying English Standard or Advanced or potentially Extension 1 going into the future. Now, how is high school English different? This is a very, very common question that I receive from parents. And I think this is what a lot of students who are in year 7 are currently finding now. Can I have a quick show of hands for those of you who are online? Who is currently already in year 7? Any of you already in year 7? Okay, some of you are already in year 7. So I think a lot of you will relate to what I'm about to say, which is that English in high school is very different from English in primary school. In fact, no one really gave you any warning that English would be this different. And I think that's what a lot of people feel when they first enter high school and when they first discover that English is this, strange beast that they have not encountered before. And I thought long and hard about how to summarize why it's different, especially for those of you who are still in primary school and what to expect. The key difference between English in primary school and English in high school is that English in primary school is primarily skills-based. Now, what I mean by that is that in primary school, you're asked to do basically one of 3 things when it comes to English, right? You're asked to do English comprehension, which is to read a piece of text and to answer a few multiple choice questions on it. And that's testing how well do you understand English. You're asked to do some creative writing, which is when you come up with usually it's a short story based on a stimulus, and you're often also asked to produce some kind of persuasive writing, whether that's a persuasive essay, so on a topic like, that school uniform should be banned, or potentially it's a wide array of other types of formats which they've recently introduced in the selective schools, like reports or proposals, news articles, reviews, things like that, which are often plays on persuasive writing as well. Unfortunately, English in high school has 80% of English in high school has nothing to do with skills. And that's really annoying, right? Because no one gave you any warning that your primary skill, English, does not really prepare you that well for what English is like in high school. Now, English in high school is primarily, and this is a phrase which I will explain, text-based. So it's not skills-based. So you're not just writing persuasively, writing creatively, or comprehending English. It is a text-based subject first and foremost. And I would estimate about 80 to 85% of all the assessments and all the writing you do in high school will be text-based rather than skills-based. Now, what does text-based mean? Text-based means in high school, the vast majority of time you spend in English will be engaging with and responding to texts. And these texts I will address in just a second in terms of what they are, but they will be usually books of some kind, novels of some kind, films of some kind that the school prescribes to you and says, this term, we are going to be studying this text or these couple of or group of texts. And you will be primarily writing in response to that text. What does that mean? Don't worry. Once again, this is a long presentation, so many of your questions will hopefully be answered. You will still be engaging in some skills-based modules. For example, as I will address later, discursive and imaginative writing are still around and you will still have to do them, but they are a tiny fraction of what the overall English curriculum is. And the English curriculum becomes much more about texts. So what is text-based learning? Let's expand out this particular term a little bit because I know it's quite confusing. Text-based learning is where you analyze and respond critically to texts in many different forms. Now, what does it mean to analyze and respond critically to something? Let's take a very common text that a lot of you have probably read before. Anyone here read The Hunger Games by Stephanie? No, I can't remember who the author is, but The Hunger Games. I'm sure lots of you have read it. Okay, very popular book, right? Hunger Games would be an example of a text. It would be an example of a novel. It might not be considered necessarily a work of classic literature, but it would be considered a text. Now, in high school, what you'll be doing, for example, in one of your terms might be the school teacher might say, okay, this term we'll be doing a close study of the Hunger Games. And your entire term, every single English lesson will be focused on the Hunger Games. You will have to learn, what makes the Hunger Games tick? What does the author write in the Hunger Games that makes it work as a novel? What does the author intend with the Hunger Games? What's their purpose? What was their aim in writing the Hunger Games? How do they make you feel certain emotions in critical scenes of the Hunger Games? And then at the end of the term, you will often be asked to respond critically to that text. And what that means is to write an essay in which you make an argument about that text. So you might say, well, the Hunger Games is about the consequences of capitalism. Okay, the negative consequences if capitalism is taken to its extremes. Now, I'm not saying that is the truth of the Hunger Games. I'm not saying that's the only possible understanding of the Hunger Games, but that's kind of what responding critically is. You put forward a theory of what you think the book is about, what you think the author meant by writing this book, and then you back up that theory, or what's called a thesis, with evidence from the text. So this is a very different way of learning English than has been done in primary school, right? Does everyone sort of see that? In primary school, once again, you're dealing with skills. You're dealing with, please write me a persuasive essay. Please write me a creative short story. But in high school, it's not like that. In high school, they give you a book and they say, read this book, We're going to read it for the whole term. We're going to analyze every possible part about this book. And then at the end of the term, you have to come up with a very strong argument about what the book means. That's a very basic boiled down way of thinking about high school English. But unfortunately, you're not really prepared for that throughout primary school, are you? And it's something that comes as a big shock to lots of people. Now, something else that comes as a big shock, especially to year 7 students, is that English stops becoming just about English. Now, that may seem like a really weird way of putting it, but what I mean by that is English is no longer just about books. It's no longer just about short stories. English incorporates, as you can see on the list on my screen, novels and other works of literature, short stories. It also starts incorporating non-fiction elements like biographies, poetry as well, and perhaps most surprising, graphic novels, aka comic books, films, even films which are not in the English language. So you will often be studying films which are in French or in Italian or in German or something else like that. Now, obviously, you don't need to know Italian, German, or French. There will be subtitles, but you do need to study foreign films. Sometimes you will even be asked to write about visual art. That's right. Sometimes you'll be presented with a painting or a series of artworks and have to analyze them as part of English. Now, this is maybe an unfortunate naming of the subject. A much better naming of the subject, as some US schools do it, is comparative literature. So kind of looking at literature in various different formats, including like films and graphic novels and even art. But all of these are technically types of texts that you will be expected to read in high school. And as you see right at the very bottom of my slide here, there will very rarely, if ever, be multiple choice questions again. Now, I think they are starting to reintroduce some multiple choice questions, especially in the younger years to year 7 and year 8. But certainly in my 6 years in high school, I never once did a single multiple choice question in the English subject in any exam that I did. There were no multiple choice questions. Everything from this point onwards is your own writing, which is pretty scary, but hopefully by the end of this presentation, you'll feel slightly more settled about that. Now, before we continue, I'll give you some examples of some texts that I studied. And these are all examples of texts, right? Texts are just basically any real substantial piece of work in any kind of artistic medium. As you can see here on the left, this is a novel that I hope some of you have read before. Put up your hand if you have. We'll be talking a little bit about this as a case study later. George Orwell's 1984, which is a very famous post-World War II novel. Here on, let me go back. Here in second on this page is a film, a German film called Metropolis, directed by Fritz Lang, which I also had to study in high school. It was in black and white. It was a silent film, so there wasn't even any sound except for some classical music, and it was entirely in German. And that was something that I had to write an essay about and study for an entire term. Over here in third is a collection of poetry by an American poet called Sylvia Plath, and that collection of poetry is Ariel. I'm sure some of you have read Ariel before as well. It's a very famous collection of poems, and I had to study all of these poems as part of high school. Over here on the very far right is a very famous graphic novel or comic book called Mouse by Art Spiegelman, which deals with the Holocaust and its effects on Jewish people. And that was also a text that we had to study in high school. It was a comic book. It wasn't even a regular piece of literature written entirely in black and white words. So as you can see, the types of texts that you study in high school are there's a wide range, and you shouldn't expect just to be reading little articles anymore. In fact, some of the longest books that I read in high school were up to 800, sometimes 1,000 pages long. Now, obviously, you won't be doing that in year 7, but towards the back end of high school, in year 11 and 12, sometimes you might be asked to read something like Crime and Punishment or The Brothers Karamazov, both novels of which are 600 plus pages long. And that will be your focus for that particular term. So as you can see, texts, very, very hugely important, and they get progressively more difficult as the years go on. Now, the next slide is a little bit about how schools tend to go about teaching the texts. Okay, and this should give you some expectation of what you should understand about a text at the end of a particular module or a particular term. Now, if your school doesn't do this, I would encourage you to try to fill in the gaps a little bit yourself, especially before year 11 and 12. But as far as I understand it, there's really 3 stages of understanding every text. So let's say, for example, you've just been assigned a text for the term. It is Shakespeare's Hamlet. Has anyone read that particular play or at least heard of it? Hamlet, very famous Shakespearean play. So let's say your teacher says to you, this term we are studying Hamlet by Shakespeare. Now, what your teacher will do, first of all, at the first stage, is to try to get you to understand the text. Now, this might take a couple of weeks. And the first stage is comprehension. So what is the story in Hamlet? Who are the characters? Who's Banquo, right? Who is Hamlet? Who is the ghost in Hamlet, right? What are Hamlet's motivations? These basic questions about the text and what is in it. Now, this is very, very surface level. Now, you might also do in the first couple of weeks of receiving a new text or starting a new module at your school, you might also get a little bit of discussion about the text's context. So who is the author? Who was Shakespeare as a person? What were his politics? What was he interested in? Who were his peers? Who else was writing plays at the time? In what historical context or period was Shakespeare writing in, and how did it influence his text? So basic sort of background information, things like that, you will also cover generally in the first few weeks of starting a module. The second thing your teacher will likely lead you through is analyzing that text. So analyzing the text sort of means, well, coming to an understanding of how the author achieved their goals in that text, right? So in high school, you'll hear this word a lot, and I won't talk too much about it because we're not really diving into the nitty-gritty in this presentation, but you'll hear the word techniques being thrown around a lot. And the word techniques means, how does the author achieve what they want to say? I think people here heard of things like similes and metaphors, personification, repetition, hyperbole, things like that. Those are all techniques, right? So you can see, for example, in Hamlet, Shakespeare uses a lot of symbolism. And he uses a lot of symbolism in order to do something, right? In order to emphasize Hamlet's pain, in order to emphasize Hamlet's existential struggle, or whatever it is that your teacher might teach you about Hamlet. You might also explore in the second stage of every text what the themes of the text are. What are its main ideas? What messages or meanings it's trying to convey? And this stage will often take the longest. So this will be the vast majority of the time you spend with the text. So after you understand the text with your class, what the text is about, you'll proceed on to analyzing the text, right? Figuring out what makes it work. Why is Hamlet famous? Why does it work as a play? Then in the final few weeks of every module, you'll move on to crafting a response to that text. And this will often be in the form of an assessment. Now, sometimes it doesn't always have to be an essay. For example, in year 7 and year 8, we'll talk about this later. You might be asked to answer a series of short questions about the text in an exam format. So you might get 40 minutes. Your teacher might pick a random page from the novel and ask you a few short questions about it, to which you have to respond. But in that third week, it's really getting all your ideas together and coming up with a clear idea of what the text is trying to achieve, right? So what is your thesis? What is your theory on that text? What do you think Hamlet is about? There is no right or wrong answer to these questions, by the way, which is also kind of scary about English. It's more about you coming up with your own argument about what you think the text is about and then backing it up with appropriate evidence. So you might say, I think Hamlet is about someone who struggles with his identity. And you might pick out, 10, 15 quotes from Hamlet in order to back that up. And you need to be able to string together those quotes and your own argument into a piece of writing, whether that is an essay or a series of short answer questions or whatever it is. But stage 3, that's really up to you, right? You crafting your response, you thinking about the text critically and saying, this is my thesis. This is my theory on what the text means. It's up to you to make that argument. Now, I can see, Arvin, you have your hand up, but could you please keep all questions until the end of the presentation? So I've got about still 30 minutes left to go, and then I'll take questions for about 10 minutes before I wrap up. Okay, so in order to kind of illustrate how these things are, or what these things, how this sort of stage of progression goes, or how English texts are taught, I thought I would just quickly step through a couple of case studies very quickly to give you a kind of idea of how English is taught, right? So let's say in class you received this text, George Orwell's 1984, which I think lots of you will end up reading in high school. It's a very popular high school novel. A lot of schools study it, sometimes as early as year 9 or year 10. So you might receive George Orwell's 1984. The first couple of weeks, you will start to come to grips with the story of 1984. Now, for those of you who don't know, 1984 is about a dystopian government known as the Party, who has control in a totalitarian way over everyone in this particular country. It seems like it's the UK, right? And what I mean by totalitarian control is they seem to know what everyone is thinking at all times. They're controlling everyone's actions. They're stopping people from saying what they want or even thinking what they want at times. And even if you show the slightest sign of rebellion against the government, you are basically, taken away and kidnapped and potentially murdered by the government, right? So it's this very scary kind of dystopian government. And the protagonist is a person called Winston. And Winston starts to gain these sorts of rebellious thoughts about the government, not really understanding why the world is the way it is, and being kind of nostalgic for the days of his youth before this new government and before this kind of dictatorship or totalitarian government came into place. And 1984 is about Winston's gradual exploration of rebelling against the government. And I won't give away the ending, but it doesn't necessarily go super well for him. Now, that's stage one, right? Understanding kind of what the story is. Also in stage one, you and your teacher might discuss the historical context. Now, 1984 was written in the Cold War, was written right after World War II. And it was actually, in many ways, a response to the horrors experienced by George Orwell in World War II and shortly afterwards. George Orwell looked at governments like the Nazi regime, like what was happening in Russia at the time with the rise of Stalin. He also looked at the Spanish Civil War and the rise of the fascist government after the communists lost the Spanish Civil War. And he was worried about what would happen if a government was allowed to stay in power without any kind of controls or limits over their power, right? So that's the kind of historical context. That's stage one. Stage two, you might start looking at analysis of the novel. So how does George Orwell, achieve his goals of criticizing these governments which have too much power? Now, you might say George Orwell uses a great deal of symbolism all the way throughout. George Orwell, for example, uses a lot of historical references. George Orwell often uses lots of metaphor and really dense language to paint vivid imagery of people suffering or people under lots of distress in order to convey how awful, how boring, and how terrible life is under this particular regime. So all of those would play a part in your analysis. And then in stage three of teaching that novel, the teacher will then encourage you to respond to the text in your own way. And what that means maybe is to write an essay or to answer a series of short answer questions. Does everyone sort of understand how English is now taught in high schools or has a clearer picture? Now, I've often received a question a little bit as well about how alternative forms, so non-novels, are taught in high schools. And I'll very quickly and briefly step through how, for example, a film like The Truman Show might be taught as well. Because I think a lot of students are very confronted by the fact that you have to study movies in high school as part of English, and they don't really understand how that works. But it's very similar to what I just explained for 1984, right? Your teacher will start the term and they'll introduce the module and they'll say the focus of this term's module or this term's content will be something like The Truman Show. The Truman Show is an Australian film directed by Peter Weir, who's an Australian director in 1998. And put your hand up if you've seen this movie. It's quite famous. I think a lot of people have. Some people have. Okay. The Truman Show is a film in which someone, the main character, the protagonist, Truman, his entire life is a TV show and he's unaware of it, right? So he's being filmed at every single corner. There are cameras everywhere in this fake city that's been constructed for him. And he has no idea that his entire life is being broadcast to everyone internationally as a sort of twisted reality television show. And the show essentially follows Truman as he gradually realizes that his life has been fake up to this point, and everyone around him has just been actors or actresses, pretending to be certain figures in his life when really everything has been fake or lies the whole time. In terms of the historical context, 1998, this film was directed and produced at a time where there was great concern about surveillance. Everyone here know what surveillance means? So, for example, the installation of security cameras everywhere, the fact that lots of devices, even in the late 90s, started to get cameras. So even though we didn't have things like, smartphones, people had lots of personal cameras that they could take everywhere. There was a great deal of panic about maybe the government tracking our phone calls or listening into people's phone calls. Also, the rise of the internet and how people can, hack into each other on the internet and find out more details about each other. That was all relevant in the world at the time this film was made. So that's stage one. Your teacher will sort of lead you through all of that. You'll discuss, what happens in the Truman Show for a long time. Then you move on to stage two. So stage two is, well, how does the director, Peter Weir, much like George Orwell in 1984, how does Peter Weir achieve what he wants to achieve, right? What techniques does he use? Now, obviously, because it's a film, we don't have things like similes and metaphors and personification because it's not a written medium. However, we do have various ways the camera is used, and that is what techniques are for films. So, for example, I'm just going to highlight this image here on the top left. You can see that this is one of these still images, or a screenshot essentially from the film. And as you can see at the four corners of this particular image, you can see that it's kind of dark, right? Does everyone see that? Kind of like a shadowy. This is a technique called vignetting, and it kind of makes it feel like this person is being spied on, right? Because these dark corners makes it seem like someone is watching secretly. So as you can see, the director is putting in all of this work and all of these little hidden features in order to achieve his goal of criticizing surveillance culture, criticizing reality television culture, something like that. So does everyone sort of understand how English is taught now, even when it comes to films or potentially even art? You'll be given a text, you'll analyze that text, you'll figure out what makes the text work, right? So in this case, in the Truman Show, it's things like, the vignetting here. Or for example, you can look in this shot here down in the bottom right. Does everyone notice how the colors seem very unnatural, sort of very plasticky, a bit gross looking, right? So you might say, well, the director used all these really saturated colors in order to convey how fake this entire world is. These are all examples of analyses you might do in class and things you might talk about when it comes to studying a text-based subject. Okay, so hopefully people feel slightly more confident about exactly, what is studied. But the next question is to ask, well, how are they assessed, right? And this is really difficult. This is really difficult to explain. So you've gone through the entire term, you've studied a text with your teacher, you've done all this analysis, you have all these ideas, but what is the exam, right? How does it actually get assessed? Where are the marks? Now, the primary way that students will be engaging with text, so the primary way that it's assessed, is through critical literary writing. And this is usually in one of two forms. And we've already kind of addressed this earlier in the presentation. You will either be asked to write some kind of structured writing. So what that means is typically short answer questions of often between 1 and 4 paragraphs long. Usually they're just 1 paragraph long, where the teacher might ask you a question like, how does Peter Weir use colors in the Truman Show to convey a sense of paranoia? Does everyone understand that question? Remember that film we just looked at just then? So you might get a short answer question where you have to write a paragraph where you answer that question. How does Peter Weir use colors in the Truman Show to convey a feeling of paranoia or distress or being surveyed or spied on? Something like that. So you may get a series of short answer questions, and they will often be in an exam format. So you might get 40 minutes to answer, say, 4 or 5 short answer questions. You may also be asked to write a long form essay. Long form essays are anywhere between 800 and 1200 words. This could also be done under exam format. So you might go into a room. You'll be given 40 minutes. You'll get one question, one big question, and you have to write an 800 to 1200 word essay responding to that question. So for example, and usually the question here might be a lot broader. So an essay question you might get for the Truman Show is, how does Truman Show criticize the culture of reality television in the late 90s? Okay, so you can really say whatever you want, right? You can pull from all sorts of different parts of the film. You don't have to just talk about the colors. You could talk about the camera work. You could talk about the acting. You could talk about the music, anything you wanted to in that long essay. Now, long form essays, or in terms of modules, they can often be one of two things. They can either be close studies or comparative essays. Close studies are essays that focus on just one text. So for example, if you're asked to write an essay on the Truman Show and the Truman Show only, that would be known as a close study because you're just writing about one novel, book, film only. But sometimes in high school, you may be asked to write a comparative essay, which is where you study, or you have studied more than one text in that term, and you're asked to compare and contrast the two texts together. Now, for example, a very similar book to 1984 would be something like, has anyone here heard of or read Brave New World by Aldous Huxley? Or potentially Fahrenheit 451 by Ray Bradbury, I believe. Okay, some people have read that. Okay, there are lots of other texts that are in a similar genre, right? Maybe White Noise by Don DeLillo. Let's say your school studied 2 of those texts in one term. Now, you might get a question that says, how does George Orwell's 1984 and Ray Bradbury's Fahrenheit 451 explore the problem of totalitarian governments in contrasting ways? Something like that, right? So you'll be asked to compare and contrast 2 texts. And once again, you can really talk about whatever you want there. You can come up with your own argument, come up with your own thesis on the text, which is kind of what we were talking about before. Now, one more feature of high school English that might seem a bit weird, especially based on everything I've said so far, is that in some modules, you may be even asked to pick your own text. Has anyone had to do this in high school yet? No one? Those of you who are in year 7? Some people have. You may be asked to pick your own text. So the school might not even give you a book. The school might say to you, you get to choose what book you read, or you get to choose what film you want to watch. And often you'll be asked to compare a film or a book they have chosen for you with the one that you choose yourself. The one they have chosen for you is called the prescribed text, and the one that you choose is called your related text or an elective text. For example, if your school was teaching you 1984 by George Orwell, but you really liked the film, Apocalypse Now, let's say, or you really liked the book Heart of Darkness, or something like that. Well, you can say, well, my related text is Heart of Darkness. Oh, sorry, let me just mute you. Make sure you don't have your mic unmuted, because you do come through to everyone. Give me 1 second. Oh, Felix, thank you. Okay. So if you really like a particular book, you can choose to use that book in your essay. And then you might be asked to write a comparative essay between the prescribed text and your related text. As if that's not enough, and hopefully I'm not overwhelming anyone with the amount of things you might have to do in high school, essays are not the only type of way that texts are assessed. Texts are often assessed in one of 3 other ways. You may be asked to produce a kind of presentation on your text, so make some kind of PowerPoint perhaps, analyze a certain chapter of the book using a presentation. You might be even asked to make a video where you have to record your voice, or make a podcast where you have to record your voice explaining a particular part of the book, something like that. You may also be asked to give a speech on your text, which is kind of similar to writing an essay, but you have to make sure it works for the voice. And third of all, and this is usually only in year 11 and 12, you may also be asked to do a viva voce exam, which is, I know, a term that none of you have probably heard of before, but a viva voce exam is where you sit down with your teacher and instead of you writing an essay, they just ask you questions while you sit there and you have to respond orally. So you have to speak back to them and answer them while you're in the room, basically immediately, right? So there are many different ways that high schools attempt to assess you on your understanding and your analysis of the text that you study in class, and essays are only one part of them. As you can see here, presentations, speeches, and viva voce exams are all possible assessment formats that are often done in high schools. Okay, now we've talked a lot about texts so far, but I just want to quickly address the other things that are in English as well. Now, does everyone remember at the start of this presentation, I said that texts are about 80 to 85% of your English learning in high school, right? So lots of you may be thinking, well, what's the other 15 to 20%? The other 15 to 20% are skill-based modules. So you will be doing things that are not related to any text, any book, or any film. Sometimes you will be asked to produce an original piece of writing, right? So an original piece of writing that's not in response to any book whatsoever or any text whatsoever. And they can take one of four forms, as you can see on screen here. The two most common are imaginative and discursive texts. Now, imaginative text, it's another way of saying creative. I'm sure most of you have experience writing creative short stories, right? Obviously, a lot of you had to write short stories for the selective exam, for your scholarship exams last year. But in high school, you will continue to write short stories. Sometimes you may be asked to write other formats. So, for example, you may be asked to write poems as well. And often that gets assessed when you're studying a unit of poetry. You may be asked to write some poetry as part of an exam. Discursive texts were recently introduced into the New South Wales syllabus just a few years ago. A discursive text is where you explore different perspectives on the same topic or idea, and they're often a bit less formal than a traditional essay. So they're more conversational in tone, and they canvas the different perspectives on a particular idea. And that particular idea doesn't even have to do anything to do with literature necessarily. It could be something as, as simple as perspectives on teaching styles in high school. You might have to write a discursive essay on that. What type of learning is best, visual learning or text-based learning. You may also have to write essays on, your personal identity, discursive texts on, for example, if you immigrated from another country, what was that immigration process like? Explorations of the impacts of immigration on particular people from different perspectives. So discursive texts are a bit of a nebulous kind of thing that was only recently introduced, but they are also part of the syllabus, and you will have to start writing them usually around year 9. And in the HSC, you will be asked to write either an imaginative or a discursive piece for at least one of your exams as well. Throughout high school, you may also be asked to write reflective texts. Reflective texts are basically anything where you provide insight into your own work. So if you've just written a short story, you may also be asked to write a reflective text to accompany that short story, where you basically explain what your story means. You might explain what inspiration you drew from in order to write that short story, what techniques you were trying to use, and how you managed to, or how you thought you achieved what you wanted to achieve in the short story. And finally, and this is specifically for year 11 students, because this is a compulsory module. In year 11, the government has recently introduced a module called Reading to Write, which is something that all year 11 students have to do from now on. And Reading to Write is a very broad module where you basically read a wide variety of text from different formats, often text that you won't see anywhere else in English. So things like news articles, advertisements, often screenplays, scripts, other non-fiction articles in short format. And you may also be asked to write those as part of an exam. So you may be asked to, for example, write the script for an advertisement. You may be asked to write a non-fiction article for a particular magazine on a topic that you're interested in. Or you might be able to ask to write a section of a play or something like that. Reading to Write is this very broad subject in year 11, where students look at all sorts of different types of texts, all sorts of different types of forms. And as part of that module, you may be asked to write one or two of those as well. So, like I said, this is a lot of information, but everything you see on screen, this is not the majority of what you'll be doing, right? Imaginative, discursive, reflective text, these are the exception rather than the norm. You should expect to have to write one of these maybe once a year or twice a year. But like I said, 80 to 85% of your time spent in English in high school is text-based stuff, where you're given a book, you're given a film, you're given a collection of poems, and you have to read and analyze that and then say something about it. That is where you're spending the most of your time. Now, in terms of through the years, what can you expect at each, I guess, age group in terms of what new things they start developing and, what skills you should expect to have acquired by those particular stages. Now, in year 7 and 8, usually in most schools, and as I said before, year 7 to 10, it's a generalized subject. So it's not standardized across everyone in New South Wales. So it will depend on your own school. But typically, most schools will help you develop the basic skills of engaging with texts, right? Because text-based learning is such a different type of English than what you've done in primary school, which is mostly just skills-based, writing creative, writing persuasive. Usually, schools will ease you into engaging with texts by doing very simple novels. Those of you who are in year 7, I'm guessing some of the novels you've read have not really been, works of classic literature, right? I remember when I was in year 7, I was made to read basically a children's fiction novel. Has anyone here read, I think it's Hitler's Daughter by Jackie French. It's like a famous children's novel, Australian children's novel. Some of you have. That's what I studied in year 7. And, that's a novel that people in like year 3 or year 4 read, right? So year 7 and year 8, they'll typically try to ease you in, looking at certain, maybe easier, simpler texts and how to analyze them. They start to introduce these ideas of structured writing. How do we answer short answer questions? How do we write potentially less formal essays? So you might be asked to respond to a text, but not necessarily in a literary essay format. You might also be asked to produce a range of imaginative texts. And usually in these early age groups, so year 7 to year 10, you might be doing more imaginative writing than you do in year 11 and year 12. In year 9 and year 10, what you will be mainly developing is this essay writing skill, right? Year 7 and 8, a lot of schools don't even ask you to write full essays, but year 9 and 10, most schools will start this sort of, how do we actually compose a piece of writing that's 1,000 words long that deals with a particular text? And in years 9 and 10, that's where you're mainly dealing with that. So you'll be learning how to write a close study essay of a particular text. You'll be learning how to write a comparative essay between 2 different texts. And often in year 9 and year 10, you'll be asked to write some kind of discursive or reflective writing as well, which they often don't introduce in the early years because it might be too difficult. In year 11 and year 12, it's sort of combining all the skills we have all at once. So you'll be asked to produce essays. You'll be asked to do structured writing or short answer questions. You'll be asked to do imaginative writing, discursive writing, and reflective writing. So all the skills that were built up from year 7 to year 10, year 11 and 12 is sort of everything all at once. Year 11 and 12 is also characterized by the difficulty of the text that you receive as part of your text-based modules. So like I said before, the text that you start reading in year 11 and 12 will become very long, hundreds and hundreds of pages potentially, or very difficult in terms of language. Anyone here, for example, read Moby Dick by Herman Melville, or at least heard of Moby Dick? Very famous novel about a whale hunting a whale. Now, Moby Dick is a very difficult novel, right? Everyone knows the story to Moby Dick. It's very, very famous. But if you actually go and try to read Moby Dick, it is a very difficult novel. And that was, for example, one of the novels that I had to study in year 11. So that's the type of text that you should be expecting in year 11 and 12. Also in year 11 and 12, you will be asked to do a lot more research and get a better understanding of the text in its context, right? So what that means is, what is the history of, the world at the time this text was written? Who was the author? Were they interested in? Were they part of any particular artistic movements? For example, has anyone here heard of the authors Virginia Woolf or James Joyce? Anyone heard of those authors? They were, for example, both part of the modernist literature movement. So you'll have to understand what modernism in literature means and how does it relate to this text. Year 11 and 12, you'll be dealing with a lot of those really advanced topics. Unfortunately, all year groups from year 7 to year 12 will have to study all text types. So there's at any point, it's not as if you stop studying poetry or you stop studying graphic novels or you stop studying films. Some people in year 12 were studying graphic novels still. I believe a few years ago, Watchmen by Alan Moore, has anyone heard of that graphic novel, Watchmen? Was one of the prescribed texts for year 12 in one of the modules. So you'll still be studying things like graphic novels in year 12. You might even start in year 7. So basically, as soon as you get into high school, you should expect that you're not just looking at books and articles. You will also be looking at art, poems, and films. Now, the final block of my presentation, and I'll try to quickly wrap up because I'm aware that I'm approaching an hour. My final block is kind of talking a little bit about how to succeed in high school. And I've boiled down how to succeed in high school into kind of developing 4 major skills, right? And the first skill that everyone has to develop is critical writing, because critical writing is a type of writing that you're not really familiar with doing in primary school. Critical writing means looking at a text and being able to make an argument about it. And unfortunately, the only way that you can really get better at writing critically and formally is consistent practice and getting feedback on your practice. I cannot stress how important it is to receive feedback, right? Because in primary school, how do you get feedback for English? You look at your mark, right? If you got 20 out of 25 for an English comprehension exam, you think, oh, well, I did okay. I didn't do amazingly. I could have done better. You look at the questions you got wrong and you look and you see, oh, I made a silly mistake on this one. I misread this word. And you know in the next English comprehension exam how well you did. Unfortunately, that doesn't really work for high school, right? Because if you submit an essay and you get 12 out of 15 and you don't know why you got 12, you would have liked to get 15. You can't just look at 12 out of 15 and know how to improve. Does everyone know what I mean? So you need to get consistent feedback on your essays as well. And critical writing, as I already explained, is very different from the types of writing that you've already been doing so far, because it's about coming up with a theory, coming up with a thesis about a text, and then finding evidence in that text to back up your theory or your thesis. Now, as I see down here in my final dot point, essays are marked on a combination of factors. So these are all parts of, critical writing. Basically, how clear and concise your language is. Does the marker understand what you're trying to say on first read? Do they have to reread it multiple times? If so, it's probably not clear and concise. How insightful your analysis is. So how deep do you get? Okay, do you make points that aren't really cliched, or maybe show a nuanced or a deeper understanding of the novel than your peers? And also the quality of the evidence that you select from the novel. So are you only using the most well-known quotes? Okay, so if you're writing a Hamlet, are you quoting only from the to be or not to be? That is the question soliloquy, right? Because if you only quoted from that, the teacher probably wouldn't be very impressed, because that is the most famous quote from the play. So are you drawing evidence from different places? Now, how do we actually develop this skill? As you can see here, I really do sympathize with a lot of people entering high school, because I was there as well. And full disclosure, even though I did well in English later in high school, my first year, my year 7 English marks were not good. Okay, and I'm very happy to admit that, because I understand how difficult it can be. And when students first entering high school, they will often feel like they have no guide, or they don't really understand how to improve. But here is the thing about high school in comparison to primary school, is you have a teacher available who's willing to talk to you. And your teacher is often your most valuable resource in high school. So I would encourage anyone here in high school who has already received a mark they don't like to do something that you're probably not used to doing in primary school, which is to go up to your teacher and ask for feedback. Your teacher will often be very happy to meet you at recess or meet you at lunchtime and sit down with you and your essay or whatever work you've submitted, go through it together and give you really detailed feedback. Now, in high school, you can't just sit around and accept whatever mark you get and then just try to do better next time. That's not how it works. You need to figure out what's specifically wrong with your writing as quickly as you can, so that next time you don't make the same mistakes. And the only way you can do that, the only way you can figure out where you've gone wrong, is if you get feedback. So please, from day one, as soon as you go into year 7, build a good relationship with your teacher, or build a good relationship with the people above you, right? So if you have a peer, if you have a buddy, for example, you're often assigned a buddy when you enter high school in year 11 or year 12, you can ask them for feedback. Ask whoever wants to help you for feedback. That's the only way to improve at English, getting feedback. Now, I do also sympathize with a lot of students because essay writing and critical writing is actually not taught in a structured way until year 11. So what I mean by that is some schools do it well, some schools don't do it very well, right? They don't have a syllabus where they really think about how do we teach our students how to write essays from day one. Unfortunately, the time in which that's taught in a structured way is in year 11, where you get this, as I've mentioned before, this reading to write module, where they actually sit you down and you read a bunch of different types of text together and they teach you how to write each one. Before then, you really have to rely on your teachers, and you have to rely on getting as much feedback and practice in as possible in order to understand where you went wrong. You can't just, be happy with getting a 12 out of 15 or getting a low mark. You have to really understand where you went wrong, right? Because the mark in English doesn't tell you anything. Someone might get 11, someone might get 12. You look at those 2 marks, they don't mean anything to you, right? Because it's not as if you can go to the answer sheet and look, oh, I put C here when it was meant to be B. I now understand why it's C. The only way you can improve in English is if you ask someone, potentially, or usually the marker about where you went wrong. Now, the next skill you have to develop in high school is unusual, might be surprising. It's research. English in high school requires a lot of research. Looking on the internet, looking at various resources. It's not just about reading the book anymore. And the important thing about the research you do in high school is it has to be independent and it has to be quality research. And I'll talk a little bit about what that means in just a second. Now, why is research important? Research is important because it helps you gain new ideas about a text. Now, there's nothing in high school stopping you from looking on the internet, looking at what other people have to think about the text in order to start forming your own ideas or arguments about the text. Not everything has to be 100% originate from your own brain, obviously. Now, that's not the same as plagiarism because you're not allowed to copy other people's ideas, but you can certainly read about what other people think and then gain some inspiration. Research will also help you discover new related texts, and it can provide you with more insight on the context of the text. Okay, so if you do a bit of research, for example, on who Shakespeare was, you'll understand Hamlet a bit better. Now, quality research in high school is not about using Wikipedia, and it's especially not about using these awful websites which prefabricate a bunch of resources for you, like SparkNotes. Has anyone used SparkNotes before? There's lots of different websites like that where they just give you, here are the best quotes from Hamlet. Here are the themes from Hamlet. Here are the ideas in Hamlet, or here are the characters in Hamlet and what they represent. Those are very bad websites because, not because, I'm a annoying teacher and I say you have to do everything yourself, because the analysis on those websites is really basic, really surface level. Okay, so if you take your analysis from those websites, you're going to get a bad mark. Rather, you really have to become familiar with the process of academic research. And this is almost, in a way, preparing you for university, which is the majority of your time spent in university is academic research. But in high school, you need to get started with academic research. And what that means is not just using SparkNotes or Wikipedia, but looking up proper academic articles where people discuss and debate different aspects of the text that you're studying. So if you use databases like JSTOR, has anyone here heard of JSTOR? Has already used JSTOR before? JSTOR. Your school will likely give you access to JSTOR. If you don't have access to JSTOR, your local library usually also gives you access to JSTOR. So if you have a library card and you log into your library service using your library card, you will usually get access. So for example, the State Library of New South Wales, which is in the city, if you get a library card there, which is free, by the way, you get access to JSTOR. So there's many different ways of getting into a database like JSTOR. JSTOR is an academic article database, okay? So it features lots of academic articles written by professors, other teachers, English, professors, English majors, things like that, where they make different arguments about text. They debate each other. They come up with their own theories about, what does 1984 mean, or what does the Truman Show mean? It's really about reading those types of texts that will help you advance the most. You can also use search engines like Google Scholar. Has anyone here used that? It's basically it's a version of Google that only lets you look up academic related things. Google Scholar is really, really useful for doing research on English as well. The third skill you have to develop is reading widely, which is, I guess, a little bit frustrating for some students to hear. But the way to really excel in English, especially at the later years, is to read more than just what your school tells you to read. Okay, so if your school says this term we're studying 1984 and you only read 1984, you're going to be in trouble. And that is the kind of secret of really succeeding in English at the later years. Now, the reason why, if you only read the stuff the school tells you to read and you'll be unsuccessful, is because if you only read the text, the prescribed texts, you don't really have a full understanding of the world that text was written in. Right? So 1984 was written at a very specific point in time where lots of people were having very similar thoughts to George Orwell, thoughts about the Cold War, thoughts about various dystopian governments, thoughts about a potential nuclear war. And all of these thoughts were being explored by different authors in different ways. And in order to understand and really get at what George Orwell was going for, you have to read widely. You have to read more than just 1984. Which means you have to kind of develop this skill of becoming enthusiastic about English, right? You have to really want to seek out other texts, be constantly looking for books to read, even if your school doesn't tell you to read the books. Because, if you just read what your school told you to read, you'd only read 4 books a year. But trust me, when you get into year 11 and 12, you need to be reading a lot more than that. Even if you don't end up ever talking about that book or that author in any of your exams, it's very helpful. Like I said before, it helps you understand the world in which your text was written much more deeply. So I would encourage you from year 7 to start carving out some time every day to read. Reading is very important, and you need to challenge yourself to not just read I don't know what primary school students read these days, like Cherub or Percy Jackson or something. You need to challenge yourself to not read young adult fiction anymore, but to push yourself and discover literature. Okay, so works of literature, start going through all the classics that you haven't read. You could start with an easy one like The Catcher in the Rye, which a lot of people read as their first kind of work of serious literature, or The Adventures of Huckleberry Finn or something like that. A simpler one. But slowly you want to gain the enthusiasm for reading widely. And the final thing I wanted to address is this imaginative and discursive writing problem. So imaginative and discursive writing, as I said before, has kind of more recently been introduced in the New South Wales syllabus. It's not fully integrated across every year group yet, and it's really only assessed in a formal way at year 11 and year 12. So imaginative writing, like I said before, creative writing, and discursive writing is where you explore multiple perspectives on the same topic. Now, luckily, imaginative and discursive writing, and also reflective writing, it can be practiced outside of school really easily because it doesn't depend on what text you're reading, right? So it would not really make sense, for example, for you to start writing a whole bunch of essays on books that your school hasn't assigned you, because you don't really have time for that. If you're studying in 1984, you're not going to go out and write an essay about Fahrenheit 451 as practice, right? But imaginative, discursive, and reflective writing, you can practice that whenever you want because they're all original pieces of text. So I would encourage you from year 7, even though your school might not be asking you to write any pieces of imaginative or discursive writing yet, to keep those on the back burner. You need to be practicing those all the time. So try to write a little short story every week. Try to write a bit of a discursive piece every week. And the reason why you would do that is if you don't keep these things consistently practiced, by the time your school introduces them, which could be in year 10, could be in year 11, could even be earlier, you don't really know, because as I said, English doesn't become really standardized till year 11. When your school introduces them, you don't want to be in a state of shock because you haven't practiced how to write short stories in a few years, or you don't even know what a discursive piece of writing is, and then suddenly you have to, try to get 15 marks out of 15 marks in an exam on a piece of discursive writing. The more practice you have leading up to whenever your school introduces these types of writing, the better. And like I said, you can just Google these questions online. So you can just Google discursive writing questions whenever you want. You can Google imaginative writing stimuluses, creative writing stimuluses. I'm sure lots of you have lots of practice writing creative writing because you've done your selective and your scholarship exams. Then after you write your piece of imaginative or discursive writing, write a little reflection piece, one paragraph, what you thought you did well, how you tried to do it, what techniques you used in your story to try to achieve, whatever aims you have. And you don't have to do this all the time, but once a fortnight, just practicing writing a little short story will do you so much good by the time you actually have to do it in schools. Okay, so I've been talking for a very, very, very long time. I can see now, over an hour. I'm going to wrap up my presentation there, and I'm going to quickly take questions for the next, say, 10 or so minutes. So if you could put up your hand using the raise hand function on Zoom. Does anyone have any questions about studying English in high school that I haven't addressed or that they want me to clarify? No one has any questions? Hang on, I'm just going to quickly close my PowerPoint so that I can see. Yes, Andy, thank you very much. Sorry, Andy, could you say that again? I couldn't quite hear you.
I am currently a year 11 student. Do you have any recommendations as to which books I read?
Oh, okay. It's a very, very broad question, right? It depends on what module you're doing and sort of what your school demands. I think I have previously published a list of books that I like before, so you could read those. But I would recommend basically sticking to any works of the Western canon, so works of literature that are well known. But it's a pretty broad question. Do you have like a specific module or specific topic area that your school is doing? I might be able to give you some recommendations.
Not really.
Okay, well, asking me, what book should I read for year 11? It's very, very broad, but like I said, stick to works of classic literature if you can, or I might be able to rustle up that list of books for you.
Okay.
Okay. Anyone else? The Eggs asks, how well does English Extension 1 scale? English Extension 1 scales pretty well. If you are confident in your own English skills, I would recommend doing it. It's not the best scaling, but it's pretty good. It's up there. It's in the top, I think 15 or so subjects. Anyone else have any other questions? No? Okay.